Hello, everyone. Here we are again. We're covering the presidency. This recording is going to focus on, again, presidential power, but looking at the question of what limitations are there to this presidential power? And are those limitations adequate or perhaps too strong of limitations? So when we look at the issue here of presidential power, once again, have the question, is it unlimited? And we can certainly surmise that the power is quite extensive. One individual as chief executive. So we can see the constitutional powers of the president here. And certainly one of the ways of looking at presidential power is considering the term, the power of the sword. So if you look at the traditional power of these three branches of government, you have the power of the purse with Congress that we've previously covered, and we will cover the Supreme Court, the judicial branch, and their power is known as the power of judgment. And here, as we're covering the president, the power of the sword. And in many ways, the most important focus on that term, the power of the sword, of course, comes with the military as commander-in-chief of the military. But let's look at each one of these constitutional presidential powers and consider also the ways in which the president's power can be limited. So as commander-in-chief of the military, this seems to be quite encompassing. However, it is Congress that has the formal power to declare war. Now, that does not mean that a president can't use the military without approval from Congress, as we certainly know. But there is at least potential for limitation through Congress in charge of bureaucracy. So if you look at all the different offices, and this is chapter 14 in our text. So if you look at all these offices, that's a considerable number of people that are part of the federal bureaucracy. And so it would assume that this is a considerable power for the president. However, how much control can a president have over all these parts of the bureaucracy? How much control can a president have over the CIA, for example? Now, consistently, if you have a president who wants to make sure that all the different individuals in leadership positions are loyal to the president, then that certainly does create an opportunity increasingly for a president to have greater control of the bureaucracy. But it's such a large organization, it's pretty difficult for one individual to have that much control over it. Convene Congress, so the president can call Congress into session. The president can keep them in session. But the problem with that, of course, is that the president can't then tell them how to vote. And the president can't tell them what to vote on. So Congress has the power of congressional oversight. So therefore, if a president calls them into session, then you can have then that Congress investigate the very person who kept them in session. So it may be that the president may not want to convene Congress, even though that's a power of the president. President also has the power to veto legislation. This is probably one of the best known powers of the president. And it's a pretty successful power, because you don't have that many situations in which Congress can override the veto. Certainly there's an opportunity for that to happen, but it needs a 2/3 vote in both houses. Pretty difficult to pull off. Then also the power to make appointments. So there's all kinds of appointments. As I'm recording this, we know that there was a new appointment to the Supreme Court. So we can see there that power of the president to make these appointments. It's beneficial, of course, for a president if the president's political party has the majority in the Senate, because then most of those appointments are going to be confirmed. But once again, this is where the Senate could limit the power of a president. And we certainly have seen this when the president's opposition party has the majority in the Senate. The president also has the power to negotiate and make treaties, and this is certainly an extremely important power. But those treaties do have to be ratified by the Senate and need a 2/3 vote of approval. So we can assume that there's going to be plenty of times in which a president is going to try to come up with some other type of agreement to not have to go the formal route of having a treaty approved. And then you can see to grant pardons. So some of the important powers that we can see there for the president. And this is one of those type of powers that is pretty universal for a president. There's really no limitation in which the Congress can override this. In this case, if they are pardoning people for federal crimes, suspected of federal crimes, and being investigated in a federal crime, those kinds of issues. Okay, had a little bit of a break there, sorry. I think we're able to continue on with this. So let's continue on with the recording. So there we can see the constitutional powers, and all of that gives the suggestion that you're talking about a very powerful individual, which we can see. However, there are limitations. So let's look at a couple of issues involving, first off, that commander-in-chief role. So there's always an interesting story involving, and this president went by the initials LBJ. That's almost always how he was referred to. This is President Lyndon Johnson. He was president in the 1960s. And there's a story of him going out to a helicopter. There were all kinds of helicopters. He had a Marine guard with him. And the Marine said to the president, Mr. President, you're going to the wrong helicopter. Your helicopter's over someplace else. And Johnson stopped him and said, son, all of these are my helicopters. And so that's a powerful way of looking at the president, right? That all parts of the military are under the control of the president. And yet it's interesting that Lyndon Johnson also went on to say later on he was frustrated about how things were going, in this case, in the war in Vietnam. And he made a remark that the only real power he had was nuclear, and he couldn't use that. So it was an interesting way of looking at when we talk about power. So he's saying that power is suggested to be very important, but it's quite limited. And will everything be followed according to what the president wants? So, for example, here you have President Richard Nixon, who was president after Johnson. So you had a couple of interesting presidents back to back there in terms of their leadership style and their use of the military and their relationship with the military, especially during the Vietnam War. Well, the war is over at this point in this particular story, but Nixon's presidency is also about over. So this is in 1974, and you have Richard Nixon, who's president, and it's also involving the Strategic Air Command. These are the military bases, Air Force bases, that have nuclear weapons. And it involves the Secretary of Defense. The Secretary of Defense, a few days before the end of the Nixon presidency, contacted the commanding generals of these SAC offices and military bases and said to them that if they got an order from the president, to disregard it. Now let that sink in for a moment. So who's really in charge? And this is an extraordinary situation dealing with nuclear weapons. And yet to say, if you get an order from the president, disregard it. So it does make us wonder too, who may in all circumstances be in charge? Will the military go along with whatever the president may say? And we can see that there may be times in which there's a very serious conflict between cabinet officials, the president, and the military. So when it comes to vetoes, absolutely, in most cases, and this has probably changed since the time that I've put these numbers together, but we can see in most instances, notice that second and third bullet point, that in most cases, when a president vetoes legislation, it stays vetoed. There's not that many times in which it's overridden. But you have a president here in which a majority of the times his vetoes were overridden. As far as I know, this is the only time in our history to have that kind of situation. So it really tells us Johnson had a very tumultuous relationship with Congress. And of course, we know the story. Johnson was a Democrat appointed by Lincoln to be vice president. In Lincoln's second term, Lincoln's assassinated, then Johnson becomes president, majority Republican Congress by really large numbers at that time, not supportive then of Johnson and some of the things that he was trying to stop in terms of civil rights and the Reconstruction after the Civil War. But most of the time, when a president vetoes a bill, it's not going to be overridden. Beyond then just what's structured in the second article of the Constitution to give presidents power, but also to bring out limitations, we do see that there are two amendments that do limit presidential power. So in a way, it's as if after, in many cases, especially the 22nd Amendment, that it's the Franklin Roosevelt Amendment. So after the power of Roosevelt in the 1930s and 40s, and you can see here ratified in 1951, there's this movement by Congress to say we want to limit the power of the presidency. And you can certainly limit the power of a president by having the 22nd Amendment. So it limits the president to 2 full terms. Now, this can mean 10 years altogether. If you have a president that's serving 2 years of another president's term who has either died or resigned, and then could serve 2 full terms. So if you think of individuals like if they had been elected and wanted to continue on serving, Lyndon Johnson, again, replacing John F. Kennedy, or Gerald Ford replacing Richard Nixon, if they had won elections and continued to win elections, they would have served more than 8 years. Then you also have here the 25th Amendment establishes a system to remove a president for mental or physical reasons. And we've talked about this some already when we've looked at the possibility of a nuclear attack and the idea then of being prepared for that at all times by having a succession to the presidency and having an individual who's serving as president that is able to carry out the task. Now, this is a very detailed amendment, and I'm not pointing out all of it that's in this writing here, so it's worth your while to look over the 25th Amendment. But as we can see here, this is where you could start to have a very contentious situation where you have a vice president, majority of cabinet. These are individuals working with the president, should be all part of the president's same party or have a very similar philosophy. And here you have them declare a president to be unable to serve. Then the president could refute that and say, no, I am able to serve. Now you have a Congress that has to step in and they can vote and dismiss a president. And as you can see there again, has to be extraordinary. It would have to be a 2/3 vote in both houses. And so if that's passed, then the vice president would take over. So we've never been in that situation, but we can see how it would be could be a very difficult situation for sure. Now, again, maybe not if it was a tragic case in which you were talking about a president who was just in a coma, some other kind of severe physical problem. That's where you could then say it's not going to be debated. Maybe a president is unable to even refute the claims that the president is unable to serve. But if there's a possibility president's had what's believed to be a nervous breakdown, then could a president recover from that and say, I am able to serve and I will refute these claims? Then you could have ultimately, once again, Congress make the determination. So we can see here that Congress does have a great deal of authority in determining the power of a president. Let's go back to the 22nd Amendment and open up an opportunity here for chat. So here's our question for chat. Should the 22nd Amendment be repealed? So spend some time thinking that over, see what you think about that. Okay, again, looking at potential to limit the power of a president. Here we can see in the War Powers Resolution in 1973 that there's ways then for Congress to try to have some influence on the president's war powers. Again, Congress does have the power to declare war, but the president is the commander-in-chief. So through that commander-in-chief role, may a president go through different channels of using the military without really using Congress because there's no formal declaration of war. So how does Congress get back into that power structure? Well, one of the ways of doing that was the War Powers Resolution, which every president, since it's been passed, has said they don't have to follow it. Every one of them. Now, notice here in 1973, that's the end of the Vietnam War. And so that's when this War Powers Resolution is passed. So up until recently, now the Afghan War has actually surpassed the Vietnam War in length of time. But for many years, this was the longest war in American history. And so Congress wants to be able to say, we have more power in determining the role of the president during a war. So it's supposed to consult Congress in every possible instance, report to both houses within 48 hours of conflict, and terminate deployment within 60 days of the initial report unless Congress approves a 30-day extension. So that, if you look at the third part, clearly that's where Congress can deliver a boom here and try to stop a president. It's never happened once again. So there is a very genuine question about the relevancy of the War Powers Act, because after all, once the troops are in a field, once they're in a conflict, is there really a situation where Congress would stop funding them and try to get them out, regardless of what the president does? So there's a genuine question of just how important the War Powers Act can really be. But it's an attempt to try to get Congress back in to having some influence during a time of war. But your text does go into lots of ways of looking at contemporary basis of presidential power. Are there ways in which presidents, regardless of what the Constitution says, can go ahead and really exert more influence than Congress and the Supreme Court and the bureaucracy? So we are talking about increasingly the way for a president to have more power than any other part of the government. No one has the ability, called the bully pulpit. No one has the ability in government to go to the public like the president can, take that message to the public, go out, make stump speeches, and certainly make speeches from the White House, those kinds of issues. The executive office, if you read through this chapter, you can see these different advisors to the president. A president can expand the number of advisors in that area. It can certainly alter the rulemaking of bureaucratic agencies. So the agencies are supposed to be working for the president. So the rules within the bureaucratic agencies can be written by political appointees by the president, and then are to be followed by those bureaucratic agencies. So does that structure then, or perhaps restructure what the bureaucratic agencies are doing? And then executive orders. They can make executive orders dealing with the bureaucratic agencies while they're president. And it's very possible that other presidents after a particular president's made an executive order will continue to follow them. A signing statement can mean that the president is signing a bill into law, but stating during that signing statement what the law means. What is the interpretation of the law? Can the president make, through the signing statement, a determination according to the president of what the law means, regardless of what the law was intended to mean by Congress? So again, the potential power of a president. And then the ability to just simply say, we're not going to enforce a law. So a law has been passed by Congress. The president may just simply say, not going to carry it out. Or an interpretation by Congress, not going to carry it out. Now, there is, of course, as we've discussed, there's an ultimate stick to be used against the president, I suppose you can say, and that is impeachment and removal. But we know that that's difficult to carry out. You would have to have, in our two-party system, you would have to have members of a president's own party turn against that president in enough numbers to actually have a president removed, or to have a president so far behind in his own party in an extraordinary situation. And perhaps the best example of that was Andrew Johnson, who almost was removed. To have then that potential of weakening the president and actually then using the impeachment and removal to limit the power of a president. And of course, some of that did also occur when Nixon was president, and to the point where Nixon ultimately did step down. His party was not going along with what Nixon wanted. And so that can happen. However, if there's enough members of a president's party in the House and the Senate to stick with him, then look at all these ways in which a president can have an extraordinary amount of power. And this leads us then to what has been a really interesting observation about the United States for many years now, is to say that as the United States continues to grow in power and influence, and certainly look at where the United States was after World War II, and perhaps it's been difficult for all of us as citizens of the United States to accept that it appears like we're losing power to other forces around the world. China growing in influence, Russia having influence, India having influence, Western Europe having influence, Brazil having influence. And we kind of wonder, where does that put the United States? But I think we have to consider that we had such overwhelming power after World War II. It was just extraordinary and not really natural. And like Rome, really, in that case. And of course, then Rome lost power. And is there a situation where, and in part though, what we also saw is that Rome gained power through the use of the emperor. So it lost that republic system and moved to an emperor system. And that's a concern by many historians that make that comparison between Rome and the United States, that we're seeing that shift in power here in our governing system away from a republic where you now have state governments and Congress having a great deal of influence to now having it continue to go into the control of one individual, the president, and more like an emperor system. And that then leaves us with one very important question. Our other question here for chat: does the president have too much power? Look that one over. Share your thoughts on chat. All right, we'll stop there, and we're going to get into the personalities of presidents in our next recording.